Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Al, and today I'm going to present to you something a little bit different. This is a reading of some of the Arabian Nights, or the Book of the Thousand Nights and a Night, as translated by Sir Burton, who was a very extraordinary Englishman, lived in the 19th century, was a soldier, was a linguist, wrote a great deal of literature, and probably best well known for translating the Thousand and One Nights tales. I went over to this archive website. I'll put the address below if you're interested in exploring it yourself. Has quite a huge selection actually of notable books. Many of them are quite old and out of copyright. And contain quite an interesting variety of fascinating subjects. So I very much encourage you to check it out. We're going to look through into the Arabian Nights stories, and you can see here the book that they scanned was from the Trinity College, Toronto, and so this particular book, very interesting art. At the time that these were published, the Victorian laws did not allow for publication of anything that was particularly scandalous or pornographic, and even though these tales don't really fit into that category per se, there's enough scandalous and at times pornographic material that they would not have been allowed to be published in England at the time. There was one way of getting around it, however, which was to basically have a society or membership in a, let's say, like a book club. And if that was the case, then people within that society or within that book club, it was legal for you to make publications within that group. The book still wouldn't be on sale for the public at large, but for people who were in that society, the books could contain those sort of pornographic materials. And again, I shudder to say pornographic. There are some parts that are a little bit salacious, but this isn't really the main theme of the Arabian Nights. And so in this edition, which was limited to 1,000 sets, this is looks like set 547 that this archive website has scanned. And what we're going to read from is I'll just flip through this pretty quickly. Feel free to pause if you'd like to read it, or to go onto the website to look at the foreword by Sir Burton. But really what we're going to be interested in is reading The Porter and the Three Ladies of Baghdad. Pretty substantial tale that has, as is emblematic of these 1001 Night stories, basically stories within the main story. So, the main story will unfold, and then you'll get to a point where there will be sort of a sub-story, and there might even be a sub-sub-story, and so on. But it's all told in a very rich, very fascinating way. And just a little bit more about the history of the Arabian Nights, and I'll just paraphrase. Forgive me if I'm being too simplistic in my paraphrasing. But basically, the theme behind these stories is that there is a king, a king who's very powerful, who has a lot of territory. I believe it's his brother. So the king's brother has a wife who betrays him and basically cheats on him. And when the king hears of this, he has his own wife investigated and finds out that indeed she too has been cheating on him. So he has her executed, and he now believes that all women are cheaters, and none of them are going to be faithful to him. And so he has his vizier, or sort of his chief minister or chief advisor, bring him virgins to marry. But what he does is he has his new brides executed at dawn each day, after having married him for a single day, before they have the chance to betray him, is sort of his reasoning. And so this goes on for some time. The vizier goes around, finds new brides for his king. They get married, they get executed after a day, and this keeps happening until quite a few have died, and the wazir's daughter finally volunteers to marry the king, and with a heavy heart, the wazir allows her to do this. They get married, but she is quite wise, and knowing what the fate of the brides of the king, she takes the tactic of telling the king a story that is very interesting, has a lot of richness to it, captivates the king, and then she has the good sense of sort of getting to a cliffhanger just before dawn. And when she perceives dawn is about to come, she says, sort of to be continued, or I'll tell you the rest of the story tomorrow. And so each night the king grants his new queen reprieve from execution for a single day, so that he can hear how that story continues and how that story ends. And indeed, the next day, his queen tells him the rest of the story. Some of these stories are quite long; they'll go over several nights. Typically, the ending in a cliffhanger. And then, if she does conclude the story, she'll also quickly start a new tale that is also very captivating. And in so doing, she ends up, earning the king's trust, having a family with him, having several children. And the stories themselves contain a lot of wisdom that sort of helps to heal the king's heart and encourages him to do the right thing. And so, by the end of the 1001 Nights, what happens is he ends up becoming a better man. Sees the evil in executing people in the name of so that he wouldn't be they wouldn't betray him, and so he is essentially healed by these stories, which is a fascinating concept in of itself. So we'll go ahead, and I've read this not too long ago, this particular story that we're going to have of the porter and the three ladies of Baghdad. Looks like I have just slightly skipped ahead. Oh no, there it is. It starts over here. So without further ado, let's read the first portion of the porter and the three ladies of Baghdad. And the way that this will work is I'll continue until we get to one of those the end of the night cliffhangers, and that'll be one episode, and we'll continue through. Should take quite a few episodes to get through. Hopefully it'll be fun and entertaining, and if nothing else, at least perhaps I've inspired you to learn a little bit more about Sir Burton and about this wonderful treasure trove of tales in the 1000 Nights and a Night. So the porter and the three ladies of Baghdad. Once upon a time there was a porter in Baghdad who was a bachelor and who would remain unmarried. It came to pass on a certain day, as he stood about the street leaning idly upon his crate, behold, there stood before him an honorable woman in a mantilla of Mosul silk, broidered with gold and bordered with brocade. Her walking shoes were also purfled with gold, and her hair floated in long plaits. She raised her face veil, and showing two black eyes fringed with jetty lashes, whose glances were soft and languishing, and whose perfect beauty was ever blandishing, she accosted the porter, and said in the suavest tones and choicest language, "Take up thy crate and follow me." The porter was so dazzled he could hardly believe that he heard her aright, but he shouldered his basket in hot haste, saying in himself, "O day of good luck, O day of Allah's grace," and walked after her till she stopped at the door of a house. There she rapped, and presently came out to her an old man, a Nazarene, to whom she gave a gold piece, receiving from him in return what she required of strained wine clear as olive oil, and she set it safely in the hamper, saying, "Lift and follow." Quoth the porter, "This by Allah is indeed an auspicious day, a day propitious for the granting of all a man wisheth." He again hoisted up the crate and followed her, till she stopped at a fruiterer's shop, and bought from him Shami apples, and Osmani quinces, and Omani peaches, and cucumbers of Nile growth, and Egyptian limes, and Sultani oranges and citrons, besides alpine jasmine, scented myrtle berries, Damascene nenuphars, flower of privet, and chamomile, blood-red anemones, violets, and pomegranate bloom, eglantine, and narcissus, and set the whole in the porter's crate, saying, "Up with it." So he lifted and followed her till she stopped at a butcher's booth and said, "Cut me off 10 pounds of mutton." She paid him his price, and he wrapped it in a banana leaf, whereupon she laid it in the crate and said, "Hoist, O porter." He hoisted accordingly, and followed her as she walked on till she stopped at a grocer's, where she bought dry fruits and pistachio kernels, tehima raisins, shelled almonds, and all wanted for dessert, and said to the porter, "Lift and follow me." So he up with his hamper, and after her till she stayed at the confectioner's, and she bought an earthen platter, and piled it with all kinds of sweetmeats in his shop, open-work tarts and fritters scented with musk, and soap cakes, and lemon loaves, and melon preserves, and Zainab's combs, and ladies' fingers, and Kazi's titbits, and goodies of every description, and placed the platter in the porter's crate. Thereupon quoth he, being a merry man, "Thou shouldst have told me, and I would have brought with me a pony or a she-camel to carry all this market stuff." She smiled and gave him a little cuff on the nape, saying, "Step out and exceed not in words, for, Allah willing, thy wage will not be wanting." Then she stopped at a perfumer's, and took from him 10 sorts of waters, rose-scented with musk, orange flower, water lily, willow flower, violet, and 5 others, and she also bought 2 loaves of sugar, a bottle for perfume spraying, a lump of male incense, aloe wood, ambergris, and musk, with candles of Alexandria wax, and she put the whole into the basket, saying, "Up with thy crate, and after me." He did so, and followed until she stood before the greengrocer's, of whom she bought pickled safflower and olives, in brine and in oil, with tarragon and cream cheese and hard Syrian cheese, and she stowed them away in the crate, saying to the porter, "Take up thy basket and follow me." He did so, and went after her till she came to a fair mansion fronted by a spacious court, a tall, fine place, to which columns gave strength and grace, and the gate thereof had 2 leaves of ebony inlaid with plates of red gold. The lady stopped at the door, and turning her face veil sideways, knocked softly with her knuckles, whilst the porter stood behind her, thinking of naught save her beauty and loveliness. Presently the door swung back, and both leaves were opened, whereupon he looked to see who had opened it, and behold, it was a lady of tall figure, some 5 feet high, a model of beauty and loveliness, brilliance and symmetry and perfect grace. Her forehead was flower white, her cheeks like the anemone ruddy bright, her eyes were those of the wild heifer or the gazelle, with eyebrows like the crescent moon which ends Sha'ban and begins Ramadan. Her mouth was the ring of Suleiman, her lips coral red, and her teeth like a line of strung pearls or of chamomile petals. Her throat recalled the antelope's, and her breasts, like 2 pomegranates of even size, stood at bay as it were. Her body rose and fell in waves below her dress like the rolls of a piece of brocade, and her navel would hold an ounce of benazine ointment. In fine, she was like her of whom the poet said, "On sun and moon of palace cast thy sight, enjoy her flower-like face, her fragrant light. Thine eyes shall never see in hair so black, beauty in case a brow so purely white. The ruddy rosy cheek proclaims her claim, though fail her name whose beauties we indite. As sways her gait, I smile at hips so big, and weep to see the waist they bear so slight." When the porter looked upon her, his wits were waylaid, and his senses were stormed, so that his crate went nigh to fall from his head, and he said to himself, "Never have I in my life seen a day more blessed than this day." Then quoth the lady portress to the lady cateress, "Come in from the gate, and relieve this poor man of his load." So the provisioner went in, followed by the portress and the porter, and went on till they reached a spacious ground-floor hall, built with admirable skill, and beautified with all manner colours and cravings, with upper balconies, and groined arches, and galleries, and cupboards, and recesses, whose curtains hung before them. In the midst stood a great basin full of water surrounding a fine fountain, and at the upper end on the raised dais was a couch of juniper wood set with gems and pearls, with a canopy like mosquito curtains of red satin silk, looped up with pearls as big as filberts and bigger. Thereupon sat a lady bright of blee, with brow beaming brilliancy, the dream of philosophy, whose eyes were fraught with babbles gramarye, and her eyebrows were arched as for archery. Her breath breathed ambergris and perfumery, and her lips were sugar to taste and carnelian to see. Her stature was straight as the letter I, and her face shamed the noon sun's radiancy. It's rather the letter Edif, which looks like an I. Excuse me. Her stature was straight as the letter I, and her face shamed the noon sun's radiancy. And she was even as a galaxy, or a dome with golden marquetry, or a bride displayed in choicest finery, or a noble maid of Araby. Right well of her sang the bard when he said, her smiles twin rows of pearls display, chamomile buds or rimy spray, her tresses stray as night let down, and shames her light the dawn a day. The third lady rising from the couch stepped forward with graceful swaying gait till she reached the middle of the saloon, when she said to her sisters, Why stand ye here? Take it down from this poor man's head. Then the cateress went and stood before him, and the portress behind him, while the third helped them, and they lifted the load from the porter's head, and emptying it of all that was therein, set everything in its place. Lastly they gave him 2 gold pieces, saying, Wend thy ways, O porter. But he went not, for he stood looking at the ladies, and admiring what uncommon beauty was theirs, and their pleasant manners and kindly dispositions. Never had he seen goodlier. And he gazed wistfully at that good store of wines, and sweet-scented flowers, and fruits, and other matters. Also he marvelled with exceeding marvel, especially to see no man in the place, and delayed his going. Whereupon quoth the eldest lady, What aileth thee that thou goest not? Haply thy wage be too little. And turning to her sister, the cateress, she said, Give him another dinar. But the porter answered, By Allah, my lady, it is not for the wage. My hire is never more than 2 dirhams. But in very sooth my heart and my soul are taken up with you and your condition. I wonder to see you single, with ne'er a man about you, and not a soul to bear you company. And well you wot that the minaret toppleth o'er, unless it stand upon 4, and you want this same 4th, and woman's pleasure without man is short of measure, even as the poet said, Seest not we want for joy 4 things all told, the harp and lute, the flute and flageolet, and be they companied with scents fourfold, rose, myrtle, anemone, and violet, nor please all 8, and 4 thou wouldst withhold, good wine, and youth, and gold, and pretty pet. You be 3, and want a 4th, who shall be a person of good sense and prudence, smart-witted, and one apt to keep careful counsel. His words pleased and amused them much, and they laughed at him and said, And who is to assure us of that? We are maidens, and we fear to entrust our secret where it may not be kept, for we have read in a certain chronicle the lines of one Ibn al-Sumam, Hold fast thy secret, and to none unfold. Lost is a secret when that secret's told, and fail thy breast thy secret to conceal. How canst thou hope another's breast shall hold? And Abu Nawas said well on the same subject, Who trusteth secret to another's hand, upon his brow deserveth burn of brand. When the porter heard their words, he rejoined, By your lives, I am a man of sense and a discreet, who hath read books and perused chronicles. I reveal the fair and conceal the foul, and I act as the poet adviseth. None but the good a secret keep, and good men keep it unrevealed. It is to me a well-shut house, with keyless locks and door ensealed. When the maidens heard his verse and its poetical application addressed to them, they said, Thou knowest that we have laid out all our monies on this place. Now say, hast thou aught to offer us in return for entertainment? For surely we will not suffer thee to sit in our company and be our cup companion, and gaze upon our faces so fair and so rare without paying a round sum. Wottest thou not the saying, Sans hope of grain loves not worth a grain? Or rather, sans hope of gain loves not worth a grain. Whereto the lady portress added, If thou bring anything, thou art a something. If no thing, be off with thee, thou art a nothing. But the procuratrix interposed, saying, Nay, O my sisters, leave teasing him, for by Allah he hath not failed us this day, and had he been other, he never had kept patience with me. So whatever be his shot and scot, I will take it upon myself. The porter, overjoyed, kissed the ground before her, and thanked her, saying, By Allah, these monies are the first fruits this day hath given me. Hearing this, they said, Sit thee down, and welcome to thee. And the eldest lady added, By Allah, we may not suffer thee to join us save on one condition, and this it is, that no questions be asked as to what concerneth thee not, and forwardness shall be soundly flogged. Answered the porter, I agree to this, O my lady, on my head and my eyes be it. Look ye, I am dumb, I have no tongue. Then arose the provisioneress, and tightening her girdle, set the table by the fountain, and put the flowers and sweet herbs in their jars, and strained the wine, and ranged the flasks in row, and made ready every requisite. Then sat she down, she and her sisters, placing amidst them the porter, who kept deeming himself in a dream. And she took up the wine flagon, and poured out the first cup, and drank it off, and likewise a second and a third. After this she filled a fourth cup, which she handed to one of her sisters, and lastly she crowned a goblet, and passed it to the porter, saying, Drink the dear draught, drink free and fain, what healeth every grief and pain. He took the cup in his hand, and, lauding low, returned his best thanks, and improvised, Drink not the bowl, save with a trusty friend, a man of worth whose good old blood all know, for wine, like wind, sucks sweetness from the sweet, and stinks when over stench it haply blow, adding, Drink not the bowl, save from dear hand like thine, the cup recalls thy gifts, thou gifts of wine. After repeating this couplet, he kissed their hands, and drank, and was drunk, and sat swaying from side to side, and perused, All drinks wherein is blood the law unclean, doth hold save one, the bloodshed of the vine. Fill, fill, take all my wealth bequeathed or won, thou fawn, a willing ransom for those eyne. Then the cateress crowned a cup, and gave it to the portress, who took it from her hand, and thanked her, and drank. Thereupon she poured again, and passed to the eldest lady, who sat on the couch, and filled yet another, and handed it to the porter. He kissed the ground before them, and after drinking and thanking them, he again began to recite, Here, here, by Allah, here, cups of the sweet, the dear, fill me a brimming bowl, the fount o' life I spear. Then the porter stood up before the mistress of the house, and said, O lady, I am thy slave, thy Mameluke, thy white thrall, thy very bondsman. And he began reciting, A slave of slaves, there standeth at thy door, lauding thy generous boons and gifts galore. Beauty, may he come in a while to joy thy charms, for love and I part nevermore. She said to him, Drink, and health and happiness attend thy drink. So he took the cup, and kissed her hand, and recited these lines in sing-song, I gave her brave old wine, that like her cheeks blushed red, or flame from furnace flaring up. She bussed the brim, and said with many a smile, How durst thou deal folk's cheek for folk to sup? Drink, said I, these are tears of mine, whose tinct is heart-blood sighs, have boiled in the cup. She answered him in the following couplet, And tears of blood for me, friend, thou hast shed, suffer me sup them by thy head and eyes. Then the lady took the cup, and drank it off to her sister's health, and they ceased not drinking, the porter being in the midst of them, and dancing, and laughing, and reciting verses, and singing ballads, and ritornellos. All this time the porter was carrying on with them, kissing, toying, biting, handling, groping, fingering, whilst one thrust a dainty morsel in his mouth, and another slapped him, and this cuffed his cheeks, and that threw sweet flowers at him, and he was in the very paradise of pleasure, as though he were sitting in the seventh sphere among the houris of heaven. They ceased not doing after this fashion until the wine played tricks in their heads, and worsted their wits, and when the drink got the better of them, the portress stood up, and doffed her clothes till she was mother naked. However, she let down her hair about her body by way of shift, and throwing herself into the basin, disported herself, and dived like a duck, and swam up and down, and took water in her mouth, and spurted it all over the porter, and washed her limbs, and between her breasts, and inside her thighs, and all around her navel. Then she came up out of the cistern, and throwing herself on the porter's lap, said, O my lord, O my love, what callest thou this article, pointing to her slit, her solution of continuity. I call that thy cleft, quoth the porter, and she rejoined, Wah, wah, art thou not ashamed to use such a word? And she caught him by the collar, and soundly cuffed him. Said he again, Thy womb, thy vulva. And she stuck him a second clap, crying, O fie, this is another ugly word, is there no shame in thee? Quoth he, Thy coint. And she cried, O thou art wholly destitute of modesty, and thumped him and bashed him. Then cried the porter, Thy clitoris. Whereat the eldest lady came down upon him with a yet sorer beating, and said, No. And he said, 'Tis so. And the porter went on calling the same commodity by sundry other names, but whatever he said they beat him more and more, till his neck ached and swelled with the blows he had gotten, and on this wise they made him a butt and a laughing-stock. At last he turned upon them, asking, And what do you, woman, call this article? Whereto the damsel made answer, The basil of the bridges. cried the porter, thank Allah for my safety. Aid me, and be thou propitious, O Basil of the Bridges. They passed round the cup and tossed off the bowl again, when the second lady stood up, and stripping off all her clothes, cast herself into the cistern, and did as the first had done. Then she came out of the water, and throwing her naked form on the porter's lap, pointed to her machine, and said, O light of mine eyes, do tell me what is the name of this concern. He replied as before, Thy slit. And she rejoined, Hath such term no shame for thee? And cuffed him, and buffeted him, till the saloon rang with the blows. Then quoth she, O fie, how canst thou say this without blushing? He suggested the Basil of the Bridges. But she would not have it, and she said, No, no, and struck him and slapped him on the back of the neck. Then he began calling out all the names he knew, Thy slit, thy womb, thy coint, thy clitoris, and the girls kept on saying, No, no, so he said, I stick to the Basil of the Bridges, and all the three laughed till they fell on their backs and laid slaps on his neck and said, No, no, that's not its proper name. Thereupon he cried, O my sisters, what is its name? And they replied, What sayest thou to the husked sesame seed? Then the cateress donned her clothes, and they fell again to carousing, but the porter kept moaning, Oh, and oh, for his neck and shoulders, and the cup passed merrily round and round again for a full hour. After that time the eldest and handsomest lady stood up and stripped off her garments, whereupon the porter took his neck in hand and rubbed and shampooed it, saying, My neck and shoulders are on the way of Allah. Then she threw herself into the basin, and swam and dived, sported and washed, and the porter looked at her naked figure as though she had been a slice of the moon, and at her face with the sheen of Luna when at full, or like the dawn when it brighteneth, and he noted her noble stature and shape, and those glorious forms that quivered as she went, for she was naked as the Lord made her. Then he cried, Alack, alack, and began to address her, versifying in these couplets, If I liken thy shape to the bow when green, my likeness errs, and I sore mistake it, for the bow is fairest when clad the most, and thou art fairest when mother naked. When the lady heard his verses, she came up out of the basin, and seating herself upon his lap and knees, pointed to her genitory, and said, O my lordling, what be the name of this? Quoth he, The Basil of the Bridges. But she said, Bah, bah. Quoth he, The husked sesame. Quoth she, Pooh, pooh. Then said he, Thy womb. And she cried, Fie, fie, art thou not ashamed of thyself? And cuffed him on the nape of the neck. And whatever name he gave, declaring 'tis so, she beat him and cried, No, no, till at last he said, O my sisters, and what is its name? She replied, It is entitled the Khan of Abu Mansur. Whereupon the porter replied, Ha ha, O Allah be praised for safe deliverance, O Khan of Abu Mansur. Then she came forth and dressed, and the cup went round a full hour. At last the porter rose up, and stripping off all his clothes, jumped into the tank, and swam about, and washed under his bearded chin and armpits, even as they had done. Then he came out, and threw himself into the first lady's lap, and rested his arms upon the lap of the portress, and reposed his legs in the lap of the cateress, and pointed to his prickle, and said, O my mistresses, what is the name of this article? All laughed at his words till they fell on their backs, and one said, Thy pintle, but he replied, No, and gave each one of them a bite by way of forfeit. Then said they, Thy pizzle, but he cried, No, and gave each of them a hug. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of day, and ceased saying her permitted say. So, to be fair, not too much has happened so far. We know that this porter, basically a guy who, I guess he'd be replaced by a shopping cart today. So this porter was hired by this very fair lady, and she bought all sorts of goodies from the markets, and piled his basket really high. And despite it being very difficult for him to do so, he was able to persevere and keep carrying this basket full of goodies. They eventually arrived to the lady's house, where there was a second sister who was older and more beautiful, and yet a third sister who was the eldest and most beautiful of them all. And despite giving him, a generous wage for his services that day, and told him to be off, on his way, he wanted to stay put. He asked them if he could join them, and after some back and forth, the sister who had purchased all the goods vouched for him, and so he was able to stay. But keep in mind, the most important parts were they had told him that he's allowed to stay so long as he does not question that which does not concern him, or in other words, mind his own business. And then they had a little bit of drinking, and as you might know, people don't do the most sensible of things when drunk. They jumped into the fountain and did all this silly business. So that's the beginning of the tale. What we have to look forward to will be, I guess the thing to look forward to the most is what will happen next. It sounds like everything's going really well. They're having a fun time, but that warning that they gave him, beware of questioning things that don't concern you, and his promise to them that he won't, I think that will feature heavily in the nights to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I will put the website in the description below, and hope to see you for the next night of the 1001 Nights as we read through The Porter and the Three Ladies of Baghdad. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.